The Trump presidency ushered in a period of significant change in transatlantic relations. His approach, often described as America First, signaled a departure from the multilateralism of previous administrations. Trump's rhetoric and actions towards Europe were marked by a distinct assertiveness, particularly on issues like trade, NATO, and immigration. This shift in tone and policy created ripples across the Atlantic, leaving European leaders grappling with the implications for the future of the transatlantic partnership. Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, a landmark agreement endorsed by the international community, further exacerbated tensions with European allies. His imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union, citing national security concerns, sparked fears of a trade war and highlighted the growing economic friction between the two sides. The ramifications of Trump's approach extended beyond the economic and political spheres. One of the most contentious aspects of Trump's relationship with Europe was his stance on trade. Trump repeatedly accused European nations, particularly Germany, of unfair trade practices and currency manipulation. He argued that the US trade deficit with the EU was evidence of this imbalance and vowed to take action to protect American jobs and industries. This protectionist rhetoric translated into concrete actions, with the Trump administration imposing tariffs on a range of European goods, including steel, aluminum, and agricultural products. The EU, for its part, viewed these tariffs as unjustified and harmful to both economies. In response to the US tariffs, the EU imposed retaliatory tariffs on a range of American goods, including bourbon, motorcycles, and orange juice. This tit-for-tat escalation of tariffs raised fears of a full-blown trade war, which would have had significant economic consequences for both sides of the Atlantic. Trump also criticized the World Trade Organization, arguing that it was biased against the US. Trump's approach to NATO was another source of tension in transatlantic relations. He repeatedly criticized NATO members for not spending enough on defense, arguing that the US was shouldering an unfair share of the burden. Trump demanded that NATO allies increase their defense spending to 2% of their GDP, a target that many members, including Germany, were not meeting. While his calls for increased burden sharing were not entirely unreasonable, his rhetoric and tactics often alienated allies and undermined NATO unity. Beyond the issue of defense spending, Trump also expressed skepticism about the value of NATO itself. He questioned the relevance of the alliance in the 21st century, arguing that it was outdated and no longer served US interests. Trump's suggestion that the US might withdraw from NATO, while never seriously pursued, sent shockwaves through Europe and raised concerns about the future of European security. Immigration emerged as another flashpoint in transatlantic relations during the Trump presidency. Trump made cracking down on illegal immigration a central plank of his domestic agenda and frequently criticized European nations for their handling of migration. He accused European countries of being too lenient on immigration, arguing that their open-door policies were a threat to national security and cultural identity. Trump's rhetoric on immigration often veered into inflammatory territory, further stoking tensions with European leaders. The Trump administration's decision to implement a zero-tolerance policy at the US-Mexico border, which resulted in the separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents, drew widespread condemnation from European leaders and human rights groups. Trump's attempts to restrict travel from several Muslim-majority countries, widely seen as discriminatory, also drew sharp criticism from European allies. His rhetoric on immigration, often laced with nativist and anti-globalist sentiments, resonated with a segment of the American population but alienated many in Europe. Section 5. European reactions, a spectrum of responses. The European response to Trump's assertive approach was diverse and often driven by a mix of pragmatism and principle. Some European leaders, particularly those in Eastern Europe who shared Trump's concerns about Russia and immigration, adopted a more conciliatory tone. They welcomed his calls for increased defense spending and his tough stance on Russia, seeing it as a necessary corrective to what they perceived as years of Western weakness. However, many other European leaders, particularly in Western Europe, were deeply critical of Trump's policies and his abrasive style. German Chancellor Angela Merkel emerged as a vocal critic of Trump's policies, defending the importance of multilateralism, free trade, and a rules-based international order. French President Emmanuel Macron also emerged as a leading voice of opposition to Trump's brand of nationalism, calling for a more assertive and independent Europe. Section 6. The transatlantic rift strains on US-Europe relations. Trump's presidency undoubtedly strained transatlantic relations, exposing deep-seated differences in values, interests, and approaches to global challenges. The traditional bonds of shared history, culture, and democratic values that had long underpinned the transatlantic partnership were tested by Trump's America First approach. The erosion of trust and goodwill between the US and Europe during this period had significant implications for their ability to cooperate on a range of global issues. The trade tensions, the disagreements over NATO, and the clashing views on immigration all contributed to a widening transatlantic rift. The Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the INF Treaty further deepened the divide. This go-it-alone approach alienated European allies and raised concerns about the reliability of the US as a partner. Section 7. A New World Order, Russia and China in focus. The shifting dynamics in transatlantic relations under Trump unfolded against the backdrop of a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The rise of China as a global power, Russia's resurgence under Vladimir Putin, and the proliferation of new threats from cyber warfare to climate change presented new challenges that demanded a coordinated response from the US and its European allies. However, the divisions within the West made it more difficult to forge a common approach to these global challenges. Russia, under Putin's leadership, sought to exploit the divisions within the West to advance its own interests. Moscow interfered in elections in the US and Europe, seeking to sow discord and undermine democratic institutions. It also engaged in military interventions in Ukraine and Syria, challenging the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe and the Middle East. Trump's ambivalent stance towards Russia, his apparent reluctance to criticize Putin, and his questioning of NATO's relevance raised concerns among European allies about the US commitment to containing Russian aggression. Section 8. Charting the course ahead, uncertainty and opportunity. As the dust settled on the Trump presidency, the future of transatlantic relations remained uncertain. The damage done to the relationship during those 4 years was significant, and it will take time and effort to repair the trust and goodwill that had eroded. However, there were also opportunities for the US and Europe to rebuild their partnership and forge a new era of cooperation. The election of Joe Biden as US President in 2020 offered a glimmer of hope for a reset in transatlantic relations. Biden pledged to restore America's global leadership, repair alliances, and re-engage with the world on issues like climate change and pandemics. However, the challenges facing the transatlantic partnership remain daunting. Section 9. Conclusion: Navigating the shifting sands of global politics. The Trump presidency marked a tumultuous period in transatlantic relations, characterized by tensions, disagreements, and a questioning of long-held assumptions about the nature of the partnership. Trump's assertive approach, his America First agenda, and his skepticism towards multilateralism strained the bonds between the US and Europe, exposing deep-seated differences in values, interests, and approaches to global challenges. However, the transatlantic partnership has weathered storms before, and it remains a vital anchor of stability and prosperity in an increasingly uncertain world. The US and Europe share a common history, culture, and set of values that bind them together. The future of transatlantic relations will depend on the ability of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to rebuild trust, bridge divides, and forge a common vision for the future.